You probably know that plants make oxygen, and you might assume that rainforests make most of our oxygen. Well, actually, somewhere between 50 to 80% of oxygen on Earth comes from the oceans. What is even more surprising is that the individual organisms that produce this oxygen can't even be seen with the naked eye. Now, the marine world does have its equivalents to rainforests in kelp forests, seagrass meadows, and coral reefs. However, the microscopic organisms collectively known as phytoplankton are the most important primary producers. What even is a primary producer? Well, in general, it is any living thing that can use light energy, photosynthesis, or chemical energy, chemosynthesis, to create organic matter out of inorganic substances. A notable and example of the rarer chemosynthesis is the bacteria around hydrothermal vents that often creates a whole oasis in a deep sea where there is zero light. Still, we are mostly interested in photosynthesis, which uses carbon dioxide, water, and light to produce organic matter and oxygen. These primary producers are also the basis of food webs, so that the whole ecosystem ultimately depends on them, and that includes us. The reason why those corals, algae, and plants aren't more significant, despite being very productive, is mostly because of where they live, and that limits how much of them there are. They are benthic organisms, meaning they live on the surface, but because they are also photosynthetic, they can only survive in shallow waters where usable light can penetrate. This zone of the ocean, where there is enough light for photosynthesis, is called the Euphotic zone, and it ends when the available light is at 1% of the surface levels. A general estimate for this level is around 200 meters deep, but this varies depending on things like water clarity, angle of the sun, the season, etc. Because a vast majority of the ocean surface is below 200 meters, the most important primary producers are those phytoplankton that can float in the euphotic zone, no matter how deep the ocean below them is. So what are phytoplankton? Well, they aren't a single species or organism, but rather a blanket term for a variety of different organisms that are photosynthetic. The term has Greek origins and translates into plant wanderers, because most phytoplankton have practically no ability to move on their own. Instead, they just go with the flow of the ocean currents. The notable exception to this is that some can regulate their buoyancy, meaning that they can travel closer to the surface or go down deeper. The reason they do this is because nutrients are generally available deeper down, while the most light is available near the surface. Being able to move up and down allows them to maximize access to both resources. A related occurrence is that we find a majority of phytoplankton like to hang out somewhere around 50 to 100 meters deep, not only because of nutrients, but also because the sun can actually damage them if they are too close to the surface. Some phytoplankton even produce sunscreen for themselves. Another notable feature is how quickly they can grow and go through their life cycles. Because of this, they react quickly to changes in the environmental conditions and can be used to study the conditions of the environment, both past and present. While there are many different phytoplankton, the most common and important ones are diatoms, dinoflagellates, coccolithophores, and cyanobacteria. Diatoms are very abundant and important, especially near the coast, as well as during spring blooms. Themselves, they generate 20 to 50% of Earth's oxygen and are surrounded by cell walls called frustules. These frustules are made out of silicates, meaning they are like little glass microbes coming in a variety of shapes, patterns, and even colors. A cool feature is that they have droplets of oil inside them that they use to regulate their buoyancy, as was mentioned earlier. Dinoflagellates also come in interesting shapes and are important photosynthesizers. However, they are notable and occasionally notorious for a few reasons. Firstly, they have flagella that let them move actively through the water. Interestingly, they are also not always purely photosynthetic, but actually they are mixotrophic, which means they have the ability to eat prey on top of getting energy from the sun. Their notoriousness comes from the fact that if they accumulate in large groups, they can cause a harmful algae bloom, such as the red types we have seen around Florida. On a nicer note, some of them are bioluminescent and are responsible for glowing blue waves at night. As well, they are symbiotes, living in corals and providing corals food as well as their beautiful fluorescence. Next up, we have coccolithophores. These phytoplankton are known for being one of the fastest growing, as well as being covered in scales known as coccolith. These scales are made out of calcium carbonate, or basically chalk. As with the previous two, they also come in amazing shapes and patterns, and due to those scales, when blooms of them occur, they can be seen from space, making the waters look milky. Finally, we have the photosynthetic bacteria known as cyanobacteria. Fun fact, they are actually responsible for adding a huge amount of oxygen to our atmosphere billions of years ago, and essentially transforming the atmosphere from then on, so we have them to thank for being alive today. However, they are also notable for how toxic they can be in present times. You may have seen warnings in freshwater lakes and ponds to not go swimming due to cyanobacteria. The other cool thing they can do is fixing nitrogen, which basically means converting nitrogen from an inorganic gas to a usable form. So now that we have an overview of all of these phytoplankton, and all these numbers showing how impactful they are, how do we actually get these numbers? More specifically, how do we measure photosynthesis in the ocean? While there are ways to measure photosynthesis in the lab or in small areas, we generally use satellite imagery and chlorophyll as a proxy for how much primary production is happening in the ocean. This is because chlorophyll is the green pigment that photosynthesizers use. Thus, if chlorophyll is present, primary production is occurring. The satellite measures the color of the ocean, with empty water appearing blue and the most productive waters appearing red. The relatively productive zones are greenish yellow in color. You may have noticed that large areas of the ocean are indeed blue. Well, yeah, but in this case, I mean that there is a lack of chlorophyll. This leads us to the question of what controls primary productivity, or in other words, what factors limit where and how much phytoplankton can grow. As was hinted at earlier, light is a crucial factor, as the amount of photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, which is basically the usable light, will vary based on latitude, season, time of day, depth, and water clarity. Also, as you move further away from the equator, the phytoplankton blooms and abundance will vary extremely between seasons. Tropical areas have relatively constant levels of phytoplankton, as they have constant levels of lighting and low nutrients. This is why tropical waters are usually so clear and pristine. The temperate areas have blooms in the spring and a smaller bloom in the fall, as well as a lower but noticeable level of phytoplankton in the winter. Finally, the polar regions are the most extreme, with big blooms in the summer but almost no phytoplankton in the winter. Interestingly, this is affected by seasonal ice melting, exposing more of the ocean surface to light. Now, just as important as light is the availability of nutrients. There are many major and minor nutrients, but the most important and major limiting ones are nitrogen, phosphate, and silicates. The most notable limiting micronutrient is iron, with many experiments being done on how iron availability affects productivity. It is also worth noting that B vitamins have been discovered to be very important, and if there is a lack of these vitamins, then there will be a lack of phytoplankton. So what limits and dictates nutrient availability? Well, nutrients enter the euphotic zone from practically two sources: terrestrial runoff and deep sea upwelling. Thus, you will see high productivity near the coastlines, especially near the mouths of rivers due to human activity, as well as the equator and polar regions. The other areas of the ocean lack nutrients due to downwelling, which is when water sinks down to the deep. As a brief explanation, upwelling and downwelling is affected by wind currents and thermohaline circulation, which is a circulation based on the density of the water. The density is affected by temperature, thermal, and salinity, haline. It is worth noting that iron, despite being a minor nutrient, was found to be an extremely strong limiting nutrient. There are large regions of the ocean with tons of nitrogen, but low levels of iron, and these regions also have low levels of phytoplankton. Experiments with iron fertilization showed rapid phytoplankton growth. However, it does not look like there was a corresponding increase in carbon sequestration. Unfortunately, this means that we can't reverse human-made climate change and lower our CO2 levels by dumping a bunch of iron into the ocean. At last, we have covered the basics of ocean primary productivity. As with most topics, you can get into a lot more detail with everything I mentioned in this video. If you are interested in learning more about it, check out the links in the description for further reading and watching. A quick clarification on the hook of this video is that both on land and in the sea, the oxygen produced is more or less evenly consumed. Thus, why the levels of oxygen in the air stay the same. Finally, special thanks to my Professor Wally Fulweiler for teaching me all this, and special thanks to you for watching.